Okay, so the first thing I'm always asked about the book is what inspired the new book, Becoming a Boardroom Star? Why did I write it? And the answer really was that in the United States, because of various social justice movements here, including Black Lives Matter and various others that really began in the summer of 2020, we have seen an unprecedented level of diversity recruitment in the United States. And there was some data just released by Heidrick and Struggles and Spencer Stewart about the S&P 500. And over the last year, of the more than 400 directors recruited to the boards of S&P 500 companies, over 40% were women and over 40% were ethnic minorities. And I began getting calls from friends of mine who were being recruited to their first board as part of these diversity initiatives. Probably started getting those calls maybe about 8 or 9 months ago. And these were my friends who were, many were Black, they were Asian, they were women, and they were thrilled to be going on their first board. But they all asked me the same question, which is they said, I want to be a really great director. What do I need to know? And what do I need to do? And what do I need to watch out for? And basically they said, 2 years from now, even though I know I was probably recruited in response to a diversity initiative, I want the board to really feel that my recruitment, that I'm one of the best directors they have. And so after 2 or 3 of these conversations, I went for a long walk in Central Park and decided to write this book, Becoming a Boardroom Star, because getting on a board is one thing, but having real impact in the boardroom is something else. And, most people who come onto boards have been in executive management at some point in their career, either in a large company or in another capacity. And sort of power and, if you will, stature in management often is created by the decisions you make. Okay, you've made a good decision about a merger. You've made a good decision about spinning off a business unit. You've made a good decision about a new strategy or a new geographic move. That's really where stature and power comes from in management. But in the board, all the decisions are group decisions of the board. So power in the boardroom and impact in the boardroom relates to influence. And that's a shift and that's a transition. So having real impact in the boardroom means having real influence. So as Nadia mentioned, I've had the privilege of working with nearly 200 boards of directors over the past 25 years. And a lot of my work related to board evaluations and director evaluations, where I was interviewing board members in confidence about the contributions of their fellow directors. Which directors did they hold in the highest esteem? And what set them apart? What impressed them about those directors? What did those directors do differently that they admired? And by contrast, what tended to detract from those board members they felt were ineffective and who, frankly, many thought should be replaced? And that's really the input into becoming a boardroom star. And one of the things that was really interesting for me is after I finished the manuscript, I sent it to people all over the world. So not just in the United States and Canada, but to someone in Malaysia, also to people in Latin America, to someone in Britain, to someone in the Middle East. And the reaction was that they saw many of the same concepts. They related to what they were seeing. And so that was exciting for me because it told me that what I was observing and what, was being advocated in the book was not by any means just a North American focused. They weren't just North American concepts. They were resonating and were truly global. So the first question is, what is a boardroom star? Well, a boardroom star is typically described as a director who does 2 things, okay? Number 1, they make valuable contributions to the board discussion and to board decision-making by asking critical questions and offering terrific insights and good perspectives on the issue the board is dealing with. That's the first thing that defines a boardroom star. And the second is that they play a role, an important role, in supporting and advancing the effectiveness of the board as a team. And when a director assumes a board leadership position, whether that's a committee chair, which is often the first leadership position most directors assume, or whether they become senior independent director or chair of the board, the more you ascend into board leadership, the more your role in supporting the team becomes amplified. That becomes a bigger part of your role. And governance is a team sport. Boards are governance teams. They do nearly all their work in meetings, either as a group or as a subgroup. They make group decisions. And boardroom stars are effective team players. Now, that may seem a little counterintuitive to our traditional notion of stardom, which is often someone who shines in the limelight and exceeds their fellow directors. But directors who typically seek to do that, who typically seek to grandstand, outshine their colleagues, hog the airtime by expounding their views in board meetings, seem to enjoy showing off to their peers how smart they are and playing gotcha with management, that actually detracts from the esteem in which they're held. And people who do that are more commonly found on the list of directors who should probably be replaced, because governance is a team sport. Now, let's talk just for a minute about the boardroom landscape of 2021 and into 2022, because things have dramatically changed. Just 3 weeks ago was the 20th anniversary of the fall of Enron. And not only was that, a seismic shift in governance here in North America, it had ripple effects all over the world. Prior to Enron, frankly, most boards, certainly here, were like a country club. Getting on a board was considered a reward for a lifetime of business success. And we used to joke and say that directors were kind of like the hood ornament on a Rolls Royce. They looked very impressive, but they were functionally useless. Now, when Enron happened, and suddenly, this was a very prominent company with very marquee name people serving on the board, and suddenly they were up on Capitol Hill, and pretty much every director in the United States said, I sure don't want that to be me. And they were very, very frightened. Then there was all this regulatory reform that came down. And we have seen a pretty dramatic shift in the past 20 years in terms of how boards operate. Most boards today operate I would say, public companies, so S&P 1500, operate in what I call reporting out mode. So most board meetings look something like this. Management comes to the board and they say, this is what we want to do. And they'll explain why they want to do that and the pros and cons of it. And then they'll let the board sort of ask questions. And a lot of the dynamic, the board is doing a great job in terms of due diligence. They're looking at, they're questioning management's assumptions. They're asking important questions. And so they're fulfilling their fiduciary duty. But success for many CEOs and executives means basically getting out of the meeting unscathed. The whole dynamic is the executive sort of defending against the board's questions. And so the shift that I've seen boards all around the world seem to want to make, I started noticing this about 5 years ago, is to what I call the collaborative oversight mode. Now, what is that? That's where the board asks all those same good due diligence, fiduciary duty questions and the assumptions, challenges, management's take on the issues, all of those things. But there's a lot more of the board acting as a sounding board, and management is actively leveraging the board's expertise and really harvesting their expertise and experience. Because when you're in reporting out mode, it's really management defending, and you're not really capitalizing on all the talent at your board table. And the shift that I think boards want to make as we enter the third decade of the 21st century is this shift to collaborative oversight. Now, another mode that we see from time to time, I'll call micromanagement mode. What is that? Well, you see it where the board is no longer playing a governance role. They've actually started delving into management level decision making. There's typically two circumstances where that occurs. One is that the board has lost confidence in management, either because of performance issues or more commonly, because they feel management is not being forthright with them. And so they're starting to ask very detailed questions and digging down to try to get at what they feel management might be hiding. The second occasion when the board shifts into micromanagement mode is when there's some type of crisis. And the idea is that the board rolls up their sleeves and tries to do all they can to work with management to try to help management navigate the crisis. And for many companies, COVID-19 was that type of scenario. And in fact, boards got far more engaged in trying to help management navigate the crisis through COVID than they were. So many boards made this shift from reporting out over here to micromanagement. As the economy and the world begins to stabilize, which hopefully we'll see early in 2022, the big question is, can you shift the board back and actually achieve collaborative oversight? And I think that's going to be a really interesting thing, which will get us to a better place than we were actually before COVID, when most boards were in reporting out mode. Just before I leave this little diagram, let's talk about hands-on mode. This is what we commonly see in startup companies. So I do a fair amount of work with young biotechs outside of Boston, other founder-led companies. And when you have a young, high-growth company, often the board operates in what I call hands-on mode. They almost operate like a quasi-management team. So if you have someone with a legal background on the board, they're almost acting like the general counsel of the company. If you have someone with a marketing background, they may be even doing the brand strategy. Now, here's the thing. If this was a well-established company like Maybank or Petronas or Sime Darby, that would be dreadful. But for a young startup, it actually works pretty well. The biggest challenge for those companies come when their founder sort of either leaves or becomes board chair, another CEO comes in, and they immediately are trying to get the board off their back because the board is making management level decisions. The reason I present the schematic to you is that when you are thinking about becoming a boardroom star, it's important to think of the context in which your board is operating, because certain norms are appropriate depending on the operating mode of the board. For example, let's say you've been on a lot of startup boards and you're used to operating in hands-on mode, and then you move to a more traditional company, they may be here in reporting out mode. So that's just an interesting sort of foundational piece. Let's shift and talk about the very beginning of your boardroom journey. I'll call it welcome to the boardroom. And to be honest, boardroom stars distinguish themselves right from the outset. Many directors describe their orientation process as a drinking from a fire hose experience. Typically, prior to COVID, the new director would show up at company headquarters and they would be whisked from office to office on executive row. The general counsel would give them a download on legal issues. The chief financial officer would talk about various financial issues, and the HR officer would do likewise. And they would do their best to digest this almost dizzying amount of information. Now, COVID-19 forced a different approach in director orientation. And for many, it was sort of a sigh of relief. You didn't have these back-to-back meetings anymore. You could space them out. And even before COVID, a lot of boards were considering a phase 2 of director orientation. And they were incorporating site visits into their director orientation. What boardroom stars do is, whether there's a formal phase 2 or not, they consider how to augment their own director orientation program. So One thing you might think about is a site visit. And this is particularly helpful if you're a new board member if you've not previously worked in the industry of the company you're about to govern. Very often people will say, the business really came to life for me when I walked through our labs outside of Boston, or I walked through our warehouse in Los Angeles, or, I walked through our plantation, or whatever it was. Videos were what many boards used in lieu of site visits during the pandemic. And I think they're useful too. In fact, very often, longer serving board members were asking to look at the videos developed for the new directors. But this is something to think about. And if it's not on your orientation, you might say, listen, I just really like to walk through this plant, or I'd like to see this facility, and tee that up. Most of the time, employees take great pride that a director has considered it worthy of visiting their site. So it's a very positive morale boosting thing. And many CEOs complain that their directors don't bother to visit the sites unless it's a formal board meeting that's out of sight. And there are a lot of reasons why you might want to visit at a different time. It gives you more time. You can see the facilities in a little more unvarnished condition. And so that's one thing to think about if it's not in your orientation schedule. If you're going to do any kind of phase two, particularly if you're designing it yourself, make sure you think about spending some time in your core area of expertise. Boards today are far more sophisticated about their composition. And so if they chose you, it's because there was something about your expertise or your background that they felt would be worthwhile to contribute to the board discussions. So it's important for you to understand what the company's doing in that area, because whether your expertise is finance, marketing, technology, legal, if there are issues arising that pertain to your wheelhouse, the board expects you to weigh in. They're actually counting on you. So what you might consider doing to augment your orientation is spending a little more time with the team in your field to really understand what that company's doing in that area. So for example, if you're someone who was a CFO, you might want to spend a little more time, maybe half a day after your formal orientation, with internal audit, external audit, even with the CFO. Get a really good grounding of your core area of expertise, because that's where you're probably going to be weighing in. And it's important to understand what the company's doing in those areas foundationally. One of the biggest challenges for any first-time director is understanding the line between governance and management. It's almost human nature for any new director who's been an executive or a CEO or in a senior role to walk into a board meeting and ask the same sorts of questions that they would in an executive meeting at their company. But by doing so, they're typically operating in management mode. Governance is all about overseeing management in running a company, not running the company yourself. And that, in my experience, is the steepest learning curve for many new directors when they move from the executive suite to the boardroom. Now, there's a lot of cutesy phrases like nose in, fingers out, or you'll have lawyers hand out descriptions of what's management and what's governance. But when you're actually in a meeting, these are very complex issues, and it can be very difficult for a first-time director to determine that line. And in fact, I've worked with people that have been on boards for more than a decade, and they still don't really know that line very well. The best tool I've ever found to help a new director in this regard is a board buddy system. Board buddies sort of entered the governance lexicon about 10 years ago. And it was a really good idea. The idea was basically that any new director would be paired up with a longer serving director. And the original idea was that the pair would meet a couple of days before the board meeting, but after the materials had come out. And the incumbent director would give the newbie some of the background of some of the issues on the agenda, particularly some of the politics, some of the history, so that the newbie felt they understood the context and they weren't asking the dumb questions in the meeting. And people found that helpful. That alone is a good reason to implement a board buddy system. And by the way, if your board doesn't have a buddy, you can ask the nominating governance committee and say, could you assign someone to me to fulfill this role? I'd find it helpful. About 5 years ago, I started noticing first-time directors using their board buddy in a different way. And it was to test out questions to make sure that they were on the governance side of the governance management line. So during the meeting with the incumbent director, the newbie would say, okay, on item 2, I want to ask this. And the longer serving director might say, that's a perfect question. You're totally in the governance area. That's great. Or they might say, no, 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 no. That's a micromanagement kind of question. Let's talk about how we can reframe that to make it more of a governance question, or why you really shouldn't even be asking that. My experience with this is that it's not going to be just 1 or 2 meetings, but certainly after a year, and generally after about 3 or 4 of these meetings, the new first-time director had absolutely mastered the governance management line. And once you do that, that's a skill that you have throughout your entire career on other boards and so forth. So it's really worth that investment. Let's talk about some of the hallmarks of a boardroom star. I'm going to talk about a few. So one is work ethic. It's not sexy, but there is no substitute for hard work. And it is readily apparent to your colleagues on the board and to the people in management when you've invested the time. They can tell when you've taken some time in advance to really go through the board materials, think about them, design some good questions, or when it's pretty clear you've been reading the stuff on the plane or in the back of the Uber on the way to the meeting. Similarly, work ethic also involves keeping abreast of recent developments in the industry, in the economy, with competitors, perhaps with new products or new technology. This provides context, and you can tell which directors are investing that time and effort to keep abreast of these things. And that also includes keeping abreast of current governance issues, which you can do through ICDM and other resources. Another hallmark of a boardroom star is they pick their spots. Board time is precious. The board only meets, some meet once a month, some meet once a quarter. And boardroom stars have learned to pick their spots, and that requires, again, good preparation. They determine which agenda items they think they can offer a really good question or perspective on. And if somebody makes that point before they do, they typically move on. Try to avoid being one of those directors who just ends up agreeing with something everybody else has said. When you speak up in a meeting, boardroom stars try to offer fresh perspectives and questions not yet asked that sort of serve to advance the conversation and bring another angle into the board discussion. And as I mentioned earlier, you should always be prepared to offer perspectives on any agenda item that directly relates to your field of expertise. The board is counting on you for that. So if you're a retired chief technology officer and there's a management request for $100 million for data systems, they're really expecting you to weigh in because they're counting on getting your perspective on those issues. So boardroom stars, they add real value when they bring fresh perspectives and new angles. Another thing that would come up all the time when I would ask why directors held certain of their peers in a high regard is this comment I would always hear. This person knows how to ask the toughest questions in the nicest way. And this is an ability that is really worth trying to cultivate. Often I would talk to directors who sort of prided themselves as tough questioners. They sound like they're cross-examining Hermann Goring at the Nuremberg trials. If you come across with a harsh tone and an accusatory kind of style, management just gets defensive and they just want to get out of the meeting. They clam up They give you short, terse responses. But if you ask almost the same question in a friendly and more tactful way, it just generates a very different discussion. Now, many of you have probably heard of something called the Morabian rule. It was developed by a professor at UCLA back in the 70s. And he said that over 90% of communication is nonverbal, and tone accounts for about 38%, and words only 7%. A lot of people have challenged that rule, but I don't think there's any question that the tone in which you ask the questions, okay, really has an impact on the dialogue you're going to have with management and how open they're going to be with you. And when there are really difficult issues that the board needs to get to the bottom of, it's important to have a more open dialogue and get all the facts out on the table. And the more defensive management becomes, the less the chances are of that happening. Let's talk about some of the common boardroom pitfalls. Grandstanding. I hear about this almost every time I do a director evaluation. It's one of the most frequent criticisms. It's some director is coming across that they seem to need to show everyone on the board how smart they are. And it's actually detracting from the regard in which they're held. Some people say, well, board members tend to be very competitive, successful type A personalities. But in fact, grandstanding is often attributed to insecurity. And interestingly, in my experience, often when I would look at a board and someone was constantly getting feedback about grandstanding, they tended to be perhaps not the person with the strongest CV of everyone on the board. It was almost as if they were trying to prove that they belonged, but by grandstanding, they were actually detracting from their stature. So I would say that's an important one to keep in mind. Another one is taking the board down rabbit holes, by which I mean routinely taking the board away from the agenda item at hand with segues into other items. Now, it's only human nature to do that a little bit, but there are some directors for which this becomes routine. Board time is precious. The board only meets for a few hours, once a month, sometimes less. And the more time the board spends in unrelated matters, no matter how fascinating, the less time the board has for agenda items. The meetings get crunched, they run over. It's frustrating for management. It's frustrating for other directors. Now, sometimes a board member doesn't have much to say about a particular item, but they want to say something. So they make a comment that's pretty far afield. Other times you'll have a director with a pet issue, and they're always going to raise those regardless of the topic at hand. But both of them are taking the board down a rabbit hole. So when you're preparing for your meetings, you always want to ask, does this question or this comment advance the board dialogue on the agenda item we're focused on? And if it does, then it's probably a great question or comment. But if it's a real stretch, I would reconsider it. Another pitfall is undermining the board's decisions. So here's an example of that. An issue has emerged that you feel really strongly about. Let's say it's moving the corporate headquarters, okay? And you believe that this would be a big mistake. So you very eloquently make a pitch in the board meeting that this is a mistake. You lay out all the reasons why you think it's a terrible idea. But in the end, the board decides to vote against you, and they decide to move the headquarters. Now, you're left with only two choices at that point. You can either resign from the board, and if it's a really big issue that you just can't live with this decision, that's what you should do. But in most cases, it isn't that magnitude of a decision, and that brings you to the second choice, which is the only thing you can do then is support the decision of the board about the headquarters move or whatever it was, even if you personally held a different point of view. Many directors tend to want to revisit that issue. They undercut it. They'll make, comments to management and the CEO, or constantly say, oh, that moving the headquarters is the dumbest thing we ever did. But that is undermining the decision of the board. And it gets us back to what we said in the beginning. Governance is a team sport. And if you fail to support the board's decision, it undermines the board's authority, and ultimately it reflects poorly on you. let's finish up with a discussion about board leadership. When a boardroom star takes on a board leadership position, even if that's chairing a board committee, which is typically the first board leadership role most directors take on, you have an opportunity to shift from being a boardroom star to being a boardroom champion. Now, what is a boardroom champion? It's someone who really is focused on making their committee or their board, if they're the chair of the board or the senior independent director, the best it could be. So boardroom champions, they lead boards or committees that if stakeholders actually watch their meetings, they'd be really proud to have that board or committee represent their interests. They're characterized by vibrant meetings where issues are thoroughly vetted. They make good decisions. They build constructive working relationships with management. They hold management accountable. Maybe not every meeting, but quite frequently, executives walk out of the meetings and say, wow, because they really got value from the dialogue with the board. And the board is genuinely earning management's respect, not because the people on the board had illustrious careers, by what they do in the boardroom. Boardroom champions recognize that boards are teams, and so they try to create an energized climate. They want to make sure different perspectives are brought out, important points are raised. They want to examine all sides of the issue. Their meetings are actually fun because they try to bring out the best in their directors and leverage their expertise, their talents, and their insights. And boardroom champions, above all, are committed to continuous improvement. They constantly look for ways for their board or committee to be even better, even if it's already performing very, very well. They keep abreast of their latest developments, ideas, and best practices. They actively solicit really good feedback. They believe that's an essential tool to achieving excellence, and it is. And they're also unafraid to give feedback, both well-deserved praise, and they'll step up and address performance that misses the mark. I once had a discussion with a very prominent shareholder activist here in the United States who runs a big private equity firm. And he said to me, do you know what the real difference is between being on the board of a private equity firm and being on the board of a public company? Well, I'll tell you. When you're on the board of a private equity firm, your wealth, your family's security, your fortunes are all tied to the decisions you're going to make. And so you use all your expertise to try to make decisions in that meeting to increase the value of these investments. That's your job as a board member of a private equity firm. Do you want to know what the job is of a board member of a public company? To do everything possible to stay on the board. Now, of course, he's being a little facetious, but we've all met directors that fall into that mode. I call them preservationists. So if we contrast a champion to a preservationist, preservationists are motivated by status, and they love to maintain the status quo. They, unlike a champion, are not that interested in excellence. Mediocrity is just fine with them. In fact, it's perfect. Excellence can be threatening. As long as the board is in compliance with the regulations, they're perfectly happy. Their board meetings are typically fairly lackluster. They're uninspiring. You won't see any executives go out of those meetings saying, wow. And they use collegiality as their excuse for refusing to step up to difficult issues. So whether that's an underperforming board member, an incompetent CEO, a strategic problem, lack of execution, they'll use collegiality as their excuse. So they're quite different. And boardroom stars, typically want to become champions, but there are certain hallmarks, as we talked about earlier. Now, one of the things I really want to sort of end on is director performance management, because this is one of the biggest shortcomings in corporate governance today, and it's clearly a leadership issue. So there was a study here in the US done by PricewaterhouseCoopers, and they studied 700 public company directors across the country, and 49% said that at least one of their directors should be replaced, and 21% said 2 or more needed to go. And then PwC also asked them to rate board leadership, and they gave board leadership the lowest score on director performance management. 25% said their board leaders, this is directors themselves, either were not very or not at all effective in dealing with director performance issues. And I noticed that it's actually very similar because this is the ASEAN study that ICDM just is releasing. And if I look here, there's a thing about, the top 5 barriers to board refreshment and diversity. The number one barrier, 59%, board leadership's unwillingness to have that difficult conversation with underperforming directors. So this is something that board leaders need to step up to. And their credibility is compromised if they don't, because boardrooms are like fish bowls. And other directors and executives know who's carrying their weight in the boardroom and who's not. And if the board wants to hold management accountable, but they won't deal with director performance issues, nobody wants to do it. It is not a pleasant task, but it is the task of the board chair or the senior independent director if the problem is actually the chair of the board. So in the book, let's talk first just about age and term limits, because that's what a lot of boards use. But most performance problems have to do with things like lack of preparation, somebody who's taking the board down rabbit holes, using a patronizing tone with management or younger directors, very entrenched. That has nothing to do with age or tenure. So while age and term limits are tidy, and they avoid the awkward discussions, they don't really address performance problems. And so there's 4 tools, and I'm not going to go into depth on them here, that every board leader needs to know about and how to use them. Director expectations, director evaluations, and how to use them properly. Something called Board 2.0, which is the best board succession planning tool I've ever found, and the new Director 360. So with that, I'll just conclude because I am hoping there's some questions. All of my new books, we just re-released Great Companies Deserve Great Boards. So the second edition will be out before the end of the year. It just got approved on Amazon 2 days ago. So some of you may be familiar with that book, with the first edition. Becoming a Boardroom Star is available on Amazon. We even have a audiobook version, and we have an audiobook version now coming out of Great Companies, and also board and director evaluations. And there's an online workshop for becoming a Boardroom Star. It's available worldwide. And for folks from ICDM, if you go online and enter the code ICDM50, you can get 50% off, which I think takes the price down to about $100 US until the end of the year. So with that, I'd just like to thank you so much and open up the conversation for questions. And hopefully this was useful, and I appreciate the opportunity.
I think it was very, very useful because I feel the part about preservationists, and also the fact that boards used to be in a sort of old boys club. It's definitely changing now. But you can't get rid of it, can you? There's always going to be a trace, depends on the companies.
It depends on the leadership. I've seen people get rid of it.
Oh, that's good.
But yeah, I've actually seen a lot of people get rid of it, help people get rid of it. A lot of it has to do with moving people on. A lot of it has to do with, you'll get a board leader who is truly, it requires a champion to do it. Very often you'll find executives, they're frustrated. They want to see that end, but they've got a preservationist chair who has no interest in making any change. So, but when you have a true board champion as your chair, you can see that turn around. I've seen that gotten rid of in 2 years.
That is fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, that is fantastic. Okay. I'm very glad to hear that. Probably because, we've seen in corporate Malaysia, you do tend sometimes to see the same faces. It's not a bad thing, but you do tend to see certain faces go on certain boards. So we're hoping for more diversity. You were asking about questions. We do have questions, and I like this one, the first one that we're picking up, about how this one, somebody's asking, we were talking about that thing about if you disagree with the board and they go ahead with it anyway about being a
Yeah.
team player, is
Yeah.
it a good idea to record the disagreement on this decision in the minutes so your stand is actually recorded, but then when it's passed inevitably, then you externally support the decision on the majority? Is that a good thing?
That's exactly what most people do. And
Mm,
I don't think it's a bad thing at all. Sometimes some board chairs get a little bit incensed that somebody goes on the record against a decision, but I think that if you're very conscious about saying, look, I realize that it's carried and I'm going to support that decision, but I want it on the record
right.
that I didn't support it in the vote. I don't think it's going to create any animosity because it's clear that you're not undercutting the board's decision. Where it becomes a problem is where people start, constantly second guessing it, trying to get back into the discussion and reopen it. Or, there was an instance that I know of, and it was about a headquarters move. And, you know, this director was so well intentioned. This company had provided a lot of jobs in this community, and he was sort of on the Chamber of Commerce of the community, and he realized if they moved, there were so many implications. But when he got outvoted, he started bad mouthing the board and the CEO and everybody else, like all through the community. And before you knew it, the CEO was like, this guy has to be off the board. Like, this is, he's
Mm.
become, a voice of dissension. And rather than being a good ambassador for our company, like, he's just undercutting everything. And in fact, the board looked, finally, there had to be a very difficult discussion with him.
Yeah, but his intentions were well, right? In a way. But yes, he went about it the wrong way
Well,
for
his
sure, because
his intentions were well, but as I say, once you make your case, if you get outvoted, it's over. You've got to
mm,
support the board's decision. And what he did is he undercut the board's decision. He complained in the community. He made, negative comments about this. He kept revisiting it. He even started calling up executives and trying to find out what problems there were with the new location and all this kind of stuff. I mean, he had become, a problem director. And
yeah,
so, and it was unfortunate because it got to the point that frankly, he was 71 years old and the CEO said, oh, we need age and term limits. Well, that was just a device to get rid of him because of what he was doing,
oh wow, okay.
Yeah.
That's a very extreme example, but yeah, I get your point. Moving on to the next question. This question got a lot of interest about, can you share your thoughts on the need for board members to now master more than one core area of expertise to be effective? You were mentioning, right, that people hire you for your expertise, but do you need to now be more than just one area, more than just the technology officer, more than just, a finance guy, because of the rapidly changing business environment? And do you find that boards these days are now prioritizing other skills like knowledge of technology and ESG in particular in sufficient depth?
So I find that technology is probably the number one recruitment thing because,
Yeah.
technology has become part of corporate strategy. And, frankly, there for many years on boards was no one that could really call timeout on a tech presentation in a meaningful way. And millions of dollars were being spent. And there were all these overruns and all this kind of stuff. And the board really didn't know what they were doing. So getting somebody who really understood that on the board is really, really helpful, provided that technology is substantial in terms of your strategic direction. But for many companies now, it certainly is. ESG is a really interesting thing. I find in the States, there's a lot of what I call bandwagon jumpers. These are people
Yep.
that really don't have any real background. They've read a few books and are now positioning themselves as some sort of climate expert. And I think many boards are seeing through that. And, I think it's useful to send people on courses. I know you've had some speakers about that. And then you can decide if you think it's sort of, the issue always is between breadth and depth. And, I also think it's a very good idea to have at least a few board members, 2 or 3, that have had broad, like either CEO experience or operational experience. And very often, it isn't just one thing. It is a twofer, but it's less functional. So it's like someone who has, say, a finance background and comes out of the industry, or, you know, someone who has, say, a CEO background and comes from a geographic region that you're expanding into. So, you know, and let's face it, you know, you want somebody at the board table. If you really feel you need, say, technology, you want somebody that really knows that space and can be credible, and also credible with your executive team, right? Not some hobbyist that took a couple of courses. And that's what I think is happening here, quite frankly. All of a sudden, these people are positioning themselves as climate experts. And like, if you look at their background, they really have nothing in there except that they think it's the trendy thing and they read some books and now they're a climate expert. And I just don't think that they're going to be credible on those issues, particularly with the people in management that have that as a full-time role. So I'm a little cautious about these sort of hobbyists that, you know, and that's not to say that's not a good thing to read books about climate or read books about cybersecurity. I mean, that's good. Every board member should be doing that. But when you're looking at designing your board and the expertise you really need to call time out on management, let's remember, okay, a lot of the job of the board is to say, I disagree with management, and let me tell you why. And so you have to have people with that kind of expertise that can do that and be credible doing that.
Actually, that leads very nicely on to Kang Sunte's question, although I do like the term hobbyist, because I do agree with you. I think a lot of probably board members say they've read 2 books and now, oh, I know what's going on with the corporate members. That's not what you want. It's genuinely not what you want. You want somebody who's so steeped in it that they've been doing it for almost all their life. That's why I think you see a lot more activists now. You know, they want, people are asking for activists on boards as well, you know, activist stakeholders and all of that. Speaking of Kang's question, they mentioned about how they cannot think about any boardroom champions in the Malaysian corporate scene that looks after the interests of minorities, because AGM seems to always be dominated by chairman or the CEO, while the rest of the board just sits quietly and just looks pretty and makes up the numbers. What do you think can be done by minority shareholders to insist that there are champions on the board? You know, from that side of the aisle. They're asking for that side of the aisle.
First of all, you know, in most annual meetings are a joke all over the world. Okay. So I wouldn't necessarily judge. I mean, some annual meetings are 20 minutes long. So I wouldn't actually judge a board by an annual meeting. I think an annual meeting is kabuki theater. And so, you know, typically the other board members don't say anything. Like, you know, it's the chairman's show. So I wouldn't necessarily draw, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't stand up to the chair in the board meetings. So that seems to be the conclusion you're drawing. And I'm not sure that's a valid assumption. You know, there is very little gained by there being some sort of evident disharmony between the board and an annual meeting. And typically there's not. So usually the chairman carries the annual meeting on behalf of the board, and the rest of the board just sits there. So I wouldn't draw an adverse inference from that. That's pretty standard. Now, if you're a minority shareholder and you feel that, you know, you're concerned about the strategy, you're concerned about who's on the board, you're concerned about, you know, some of those. It's like, for example, let's say there's nobody on the board that you think could call timeout on a tech presentation. You know, there should be channels where you can reach out to you know, the board. There's usually someone designated, whether that's the senior independent director, whether that's, there should be an independent board leader or the chair, or, you know, people in investor relations, and say, look, I want a meeting, and, you know, or we're concerned about this and thus and so. Sometimes it's really valid, and sometimes it you know, that someone is actually paying attention to that. I mean, I have a client who is very mindful of letters they get from minority shareholders. They talk about them in the board meetings. They have their general counsel comes and says, this is the kind of stuff they're getting. And some of it's not valid. Some of them are good points, you know, and like, for example, they brought up the fact, they said, you know, we need, because of the direction this company's going, we just think there needs to be 1 or 2 younger directors. They took that to heart and they went out and recruited 2 younger directors, but they didn't do anything like out at the annual meeting. That all happened behind the scenes.
Okay, that's a very, very good point. I never thought about it that way. And yes, I do agree that a lot of meetings that annual general meetings I've been to do tend to go into kabuki theater, as you mentioned. But it's good that there are so the conclusion is there should be channels for minority shareholders to have an almost direct line to the board so they can actually take it to heart.
Well, I would see what there is. I mean, typically the leader of the independent directors is supposed to play some sort of role. And, there's usually in the proxy something that's set up who you contact, like in that someone is identified. If there's not, then you should talk to the people in investor relations and say, hey, we have this majority. We would like to express our views to someone on the board. And, if you're getting dodged around by that, then I would send a letter. I would probably address it to the chair, the senior independent director, and, lay out your things, ask for a meeting, ask for a discussion. Yeah. Lots of people do that. Lots of people do that. I mean, like here, BlackRock is constantly meeting with board members. And sometimes, I mean, they're a huge player, obviously, but sometimes they're not a majority shareholder. People like directors will still meet with them.
Okay, I think that's a good point. Something to take away and tuck in. Leela is asking, we're talking about the buddy system that you mentioned. And in being a new board member, they ask, is it better to ask for a buddy from the nomination committee, as you suggested, or the board member themselves will connect and work and click with one of the more older, grounded board members? Which option do you feel is better, and what difference can the outcome bring? Basically, the nomination committee versus somebody that you probably know.
Well,
or at least
if you already know somebody and you're comfortable with them, then that probably works fine. If you know them, because you want, first of all, you want to make sure that the person you're assigned to actually knows the governance management line. Okay. Because that's what you're there to try and learn. So if they don't understand that, then they're not going to be able to help you. But if this is somebody and you have a past relationship with, then it might be easy to just especially if they don't have a formal program. If they have a formal program, then they're going to assign you to somebody, and I would work with them. It's a chance to build a new relationship with somebody else. If you don't know anybody on the board, though, and if they don't have a board buddy system, then I would go to the nominating governance committee and say, hey, I'm a new director, and I would find it really useful, and let them choose who they would, because usually nom-gov committees are very mindful about who they assign, and they typically choose someone that they think would be sort of a good mentor and who does understand the governance management line. And you may not know the board very well if you're new and you've only been at like 1 or 2 meetings, and so they might be able to help you. But the bottom line is, if you're new and there's no board buddy system, whether it's someone you know or you're asking the nominating governance committee, go do it and put it in place, because it's going to help you a lot.
All right. Have you, when you've seen this board buddy system in place, in real world examples, does the person definitely just pick it up like that? Is it very much dependent on the director themselves as well? Or is it just like the system?
Well, the first and most important thing is I've had boards that tell me they have a board buddy system and it's a joke. They'll assign a longer serving director to a newbie, and the longer serving director says, call me if you need anything. Well, that does nothing. The process only works when the two people are fairly, disciplined about scheduling a meeting before every board meeting after the materials have come out. And so, you can do it on Zoom now, which makes it much easier. And you're just absolutely disciplined about that. And if you do that, after my experiences, certainly after a year of that, but really after about 3 or 4 meetings, the new director is really getting a flavor for that governance management line. And that's a skill that they can take with them for the rest of their career. But what it's also doing, it's giving them some background on, some of these issues, particularly some of the politics. You're never going to get that in a director orientation program, because it's usually management that's doing that. They're not going to tell you about the politics or even some of the, history that as a board member, you'd probably want to know, whereas a board buddy is probably going to tell you that. That's what they're supposed to.
I think the phrase I used when we talked about this last time was lay of the land, right? You just need to know where the pitfalls are, and that's where the buddy system kind of comes in. We have time for a couple more questions. Somebody is asking that this person says your presentation was excellent, and then they say they generally find that independent directors are committed to diversity, enhancing board skill sets, etc. But non-independent directors or shareholders tend to nominate directors on their own priorities. Is this a fair comment?
Yeah, absolutely it is. Absolutely it is, because you know, if you have a right, because I see this with private equity funds here. Okay. So if you have a certain stake and you're allowed a board seat because of that, there is a direction in which you want that company to go. And even though you have a fiduciary duty to all stakeholders, you tend to put people on the board that you think are probably going to help advance the direction you think the company should be going. That's not necessarily a bad thing. As a private equity person, you probably want the company to be successful so that your investment is, it flourishes. But I think you do see that dynamic with private equity and other major stakeholders, that there's a direction they think the company should go. Whereas independents, that all said, all directors have a fiduciary duty to all shareholders and stakeholders of companies. So
yeah, I think that's the one thing they kind of have to also remember, take in mind, or at least always remind themselves. Is it then down to the chair, you think, to set the mood for the
it gets back to a couple of things. I mean, like, it gets back to chairs who are unwilling. I will tell you, if a chair is unwilling to have a conversation with a board member who either doesn't say anything, constantly makes off the wall comments, clearly comes unprepared, or uses a patronizing tone, if a chair won't step up to that, they're certainly not going to step up to a majority shareholder. Okay.
Oh,
so,
for sure.
Right. Like, so it really should fall to the chair, but you need a champion to do it. And have I seen that? Yeah, sure I have. Because I am in the kind of work that I do is about making good boards great and keeping great boards vibrant. So most of my clients actually are champions. Preservationists aren't too interested in working with me because, they're happy with the status quo. So,
yeah. I think the good question to end this on is one that's asking about we were mentioning landscape and lay of the land, but what if some nominated directors are politically connected and some people think they do not bring value to a board? What can a board do there? Is it just managing their way around it?
Well, that happens a lot in Malaysia. I know that. And so I would say that in that situation, it's really important to have a really good director evaluation process. And I'm not talking about Circle 5 and write-ins. Okay, that's 1996 technology. The first time I ever did a board evaluation, I did it for one of the big Canadian banks. And it was the first one ever done in North America. What did we do? We did Circle 5 with write-ins. Okay. This was done in 1996. That's people were listening to music on Sony Walkmans in 1996. Okay. We've come a long way.
We have come a very long way.
We've come a very long way. So don't use, if you're going to do director evaluation, don't do that. You want to do interviews. You have to do interviews. And it could be the chair. If you have a champion chair who will step up and do it, you can bring in a third party. And, it's simple. I mean, I do them all the time. You'll talk to every member of the board. And so, Nadia, let's say you're on the board. I'll say, Nadia, let's talk about Azim. What impresses you about him? What do you think is really good? And you say, oh, I love Azim. He's just great. He's my favorite director. And then I'll probe and say, well, what does he do that really impresses you, Nadia? And you're going to say, oh, he's a tech guy. And he brings up so many good points. And I know I can rely on him. He makes me so comfortable because I'm like a finance person and that's great. He can rely on me, but okay, great. So now I've got some really useful feedback for Azim. And then I'll say, now, if you were going to give Azim any feedback that could make him even better, could make him more effective than he is, what would you tell him to either do or stop doing or whatever? And I don't know, Nadia might say, well, he's in these meetings and it's really evident he's looking at his phone through half the thing. He seems attentive, even if we're on Zoom, 2 meetings, he just got up and walked away. Okay. Now I've got some really useful, specific feedback for Azim because he realizes, and that's actionable feedback. When you're doing scores, you just make people mad if they get low scores, but you don't deliver actionable feedback to them. So if you're going to do it, you want to make it worthwhile. So if you've got a bunch of people and they're politically appointed and you don't feel you can get rid of them easily, then these types of feedback vehicles, number one, about 80% of the time, if you give them constructive, specific, actionable, balanced feedback, okay, they'll act on it. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, if you're doing that and they're simply not stepping up to it, then that actually paves a path that, you know, you might be able to suggest that it's time for a change, even if they are politically correct. But I would say if you do that type of process, 80% of the time, you're going to see some improvement, actually.
I think that's a wonderful thing to kind of end it on for today. Thank you so much for all your insights and the wonderful presentation. That's what everybody in the chat's been saying.